Hello, my friends. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Thank you for joining me once again. More than 2,000 years ago, one man challenged the most powerful empire on earth. Rome ruled vast territories, commanded powerful armies, and controlled millions of people. Most believed its power could never be threatened. Yet a single slave would one day inspire fear throughout the Roman Republic and become one of the most legendary figures in history. His name was Spartacus. Long before he became famous, Spartacus was believed to have been born in Thrace, a region located in southeastern Europe. He grew up in a world shaped by war, survival, and constant struggle. Like many men of his time, he learned how to fight at an early age. Historical records suggest that he may have served as a soldier and possessed valuable military skills. These abilities would later play a crucial role in his life. But at the time, he was simply trying to survive in a dangerous world. Eventually, circumstances brought him into conflict with Rome. The exact details remain uncertain, but historians believe he was captured by Roman forces and taken prisoner. In a single moment, everything changed. The free man who once controlled his own future lost his freedom. He was no longer treated as a person with rights or choices. Instead, he became property, like thousands of others captured during Rome's expansion. Spartacus was sold into slavery. For many slaves, this fate meant a lifetime of hard labor, suffering, and hopelessness. Few ever escaped. Fewer still were remembered by history, yet Spartacus was about to enter a world even more brutal than ordinary slavery. Because of his strength, physical condition, and fighting experience, he attracted the attention of people who saw an opportunity to profit from him. Rather than being sent to work in fields or mines, he was selected for a different purpose. The Romans wanted him to become a gladiator. To the crowds who filled Roman arenas, gladiators were sources of entertainment. They were expected to fight, suffer, and risk their lives for public spectacle. Some achieved fame, but almost none gained freedom. As Spartacus was transported toward a gladiator training school, he could not have known that the decision made by his captors would eventually threaten the very empire that enslaved him. What awaited him behind those walls was a harsh reality that would test every part of his spirit and push him toward a choice that could change history forever. Spartacus soon arrived at a gladiator training school in Capua, one of the most famous training centers in the Roman Republic. To outsiders, gladiators often appeared strong, respected, and admired by large crowds. The reality was very different. Behind the walls of the school, life was controlled by strict discipline, harsh rules, and constant danger. The men who lived there were not free athletes competing for glory. Most were slaves, prisoners, or individuals forced into a life they had never chosen. Every day revolved around training, obedience, and preparation for future battles in the arena. The owners of the school viewed gladiators as investments. Strong fighters could earn money and entertain thousands of spectators. Because of this, they were trained intensely and monitored closely. Spartacus quickly learned that every aspect of his life was controlled by others. He could not decide where he lived, what he did, or what future awaited him. His strength belonged to the people who owned him. His skills were used for their profit. For a man who had once lived freely, the loss of control was difficult to accept. Yet Spartacus was observant. He watched the routines of the guards, studied the behavior of those around him, and learned how the school operated. At the same time, he formed connections with other gladiators who shared similar frustrations. Many had lost their freedom. Many dreamed of escaping. Most believed such a dream was impossible. Rome was powerful, organized, and relentless. Anyone who escaped was usually captured again. Still, the desire for freedom remained alive. As months passed, that desire grew stronger. Spartacus and several other gladiators began discussing possibilities that others were too afraid to consider. They understood the risks. Failure would almost certainly lead to severe punishment. Success seemed unlikely, yet remaining where they were meant accepting a future controlled entirely by others. Eventually, a secret plan began to take shape. The gladiators would attempt to escape before they were sent into future contests. It was a dangerous idea, and only a small number were willing to participate. They had limited resources, no army, and almost no chance of defeating Roman authority, if discovered. Nevertheless, desperation often creates courage. The men understood that freedom rarely arrives on its own. Sometimes it must be pursued, even when the odds appear impossible. For Spartacus, the decision was becoming clear. He could continue living as property, or he could risk everything for a chance at freedom. Soon, that choice would place him on a path that neither he nor Rome could ever have imagined. And when the moment finally arrived, a handful of gladiators armed with little more than determination would begin one of the most famous rebellions in ancient history. The opportunity finally came in 73 BC. Spartacus and a small group of fellow gladiators put their plan into action. According to historical accounts, around 70 men participated in the escape. They were not equipped like soldiers, nor did they possess large supplies or powerful weapons. At first, they relied on whatever they could find. The odds were overwhelmingly against them. Rome controlled vast territories and maintained one of the most effective military systems in the ancient world. A handful of escaped slaves seemed insignificant by comparison, yet what happened next would surprise everyone. The group managed to break free from the gladiator school and escape into the countryside. During their flight, they acquired weapons and supplies that dramatically improved their chances of survival. More importantly, they gained something that had been denied to them for years: freedom. For the first time in a long time, they were making their own decisions, rather than separating and hiding. Spartacus and his companions chose to remain together. They understood that unity offered their best chance of survival. Soon, news of the escape began spreading across the region. Other slaves heard the story and saw something they had not felt in years: hope. As word traveled from town to town, more people started joining the growing group. What had begun as a small escape was gradually turning into a movement. Spartacus emerged as one of its natural leaders. His military experience, confidence, and ability to organize people helped transform a group of fugitives into a disciplined force. Meanwhile, Roman officials paid little attention to the situation. From their perspective, this was merely a local disturbance caused by escaped slaves. Rome had defeated powerful kingdoms and conquered vast territories. A few dozen former gladiators did not appear to be a serious threat. As a result, the authorities made a critical mistake. Instead of responding with overwhelming force, they sent relatively small groups of soldiers to deal with the problem. They expected a quick and easy victory. The Romans assumed that fear alone would scatter the rebels and restore order. They underestimated both Spartacus and the determination of the people following him. When Roman forces finally confronted the rebels, they discovered that these former slaves were far more capable than expected. Spartacus used intelligence, discipline, and creativity to overcome challenges that should have destroyed his movement. To the shock of Roman commanders, the rebels achieved victories that few thought possible. Each success attracted more followers. Each victory increased confidence among those who dreamed of freedom. What Rome believed would be a short-lived problem was rapidly becoming something much larger. For the first time, Roman leaders began realizing that Spartacus was not simply an escaped slave. He was becoming the leader of a rebellion. And as thousands more people prepared to join his cause, the Roman Republic was about to face a challenge, unlike any it had expected. As Spartacus continued winning battles against Roman forces, his reputation spread throughout Italy. What began as a small group of escaped gladiators was transforming into something far more powerful. Slaves working on farms, in workshops, and on large estates heard stories about a man who had successfully challenged Rome and survived. For people who had spent years living without freedom, the stories sounded almost unbelievable. Yet they were true. More and more individuals abandoned their former lives and joined Spartacus. The rebel force grew from dozens to hundreds, and from hundreds to thousands. Before long, tens of thousands of men, women, and children were traveling with the movement. Managing such a large group created enormous challenges. They needed food, shelter, organization, and protection. Spartacus could no longer think like an escaped slave. He had to think like a leader responsible for the lives of thousands. Remarkably, he adapted to the role, using the military skills he had learned earlier in life. He organized his followers and prepared them for future conflicts. Many of the new recruits had little or no combat experience, but they shared a powerful motivation. They were fighting for the chance to control their own futures. That desire often proved stronger than fear. Meanwhile, Roman leaders became increasingly concerned. Reports continued arriving from commanders who had underestimated the rebellion and suffered unexpected defeats. What had initially appeared to be a local problem was now threatening the stability of entire regions. Trade routes became unsafe. Wealthy landowners worried about losing their labor force. Fear began spreading among those who benefited from Rome's system of slavery. Yet despite the growing danger, the rebels continued achieving success. Their victories boosted morale and attracted even more supporters. For many people living under Roman rule, Spartacus became a symbol of resistance and hope. Some saw him as a liberator. Others viewed him as a dangerous rebel. Regardless of opinion, one fact was becoming impossible to ignore: Rome was struggling to stop him. At several points, Spartacus had opportunities to leave Italy and lead his followers toward freedom beyond Roman control. Historians still debate exactly why he remained. Some believe he hoped to help even more slaves escape. Others believe circumstances forced him to change direction. Whatever the reason, his decisions would have enormous consequences. The longer the rebellion continued, the more determined Rome became to destroy it. Powerful political leaders began recognizing that the situation could no longer be handled by small military forces. The Republic needed a stronger response. As the rebellion reached its peak, Spartacus commanded one of the largest forces in Italy. He had accomplished something that almost no slave in Roman history had ever achieved. Yet his greatest challenge was still ahead, because Rome was finally preparing to send a commander capable of ending the rebellion once and for all. Now, the rebellion led by Spartacus had grown far beyond anything Rome had expected. What began with fewer than 100 escaped gladiators had become a force numbering in the tens of thousands. Entire regions of Italy had witnessed the movement's growth, and stories about Spartacus spread faster with every passing month. Roman citizens who once ignored the rebellion now spoke about it with concern. Wealthy landowners feared losing their workers, Politicians worried about instability. Military leaders faced an uncomfortable reality. Rome had suffered a series of embarrassing defeats against people it had once dismissed as powerless. Spartacus had achieved something extraordinary. He was not leading a professional army trained from childhood for warfare. Many of his followers had spent years working as slaves, yet under his leadership, they had repeatedly survived encounters with Roman forces and continued expanding their influence. His ability to inspire loyalty became one of his greatest strengths. People followed him because he represented something larger than military success. He represented the possibility of freedom. At the same time, however, maintaining such a large movement became increasingly difficult. Feeding thousands of people required constant planning. Different groups within the rebellion sometimes disagreed about what should happen next. Some wanted to leave Italy as soon as possible and seek safety elsewhere. Others wanted to continue challenging Roman authority. As the movement grew, so did the complexity of leading it. Spartacus found himself carrying responsibilities that few could have imagined when the rebellion first began. Meanwhile, Rome finally decided that the situation demanded a far stronger response. The Republic turned to Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest and most influential men in Rome. Unlike previous commanders, Crassus understood that underestimating Spartacus would be a mistake. He approached the rebellion with seriousness, discipline, and determination. New armies were assembled, resources were committed, detailed strategies were developed. Rome was no longer treating the uprising as a temporary disturbance. It had become a national priority. As Crassus moved against the rebels, the pressure on Spartacus increased dramatically. For the first time since the rebellion began, he faced an opponent who fully recognized the danger he posed. The easy victories of earlier years were disappearing. Every decision became more important. Every mistake carried greater consequences. Spartacus still dreamed of securing freedom for his followers. But the path ahead was becoming narrower. Rome's power was beginning to close around him. The rebellion that had once seemed unstoppable was entering its most dangerous phase. Soon, Spartacus would face choices that could determine the future of everyone who had placed their hopes in him. And one decision, made during these critical months, would lead directly toward the final chapter of his remarkable story. As the rebellion entered its final stage, the balance of power slowly began shifting in Rome's favor. For years, Spartacus had achieved what many considered impossible. He had escaped slavery, defeated multiple Roman forces, and inspired tens of thousands of people to follow him. Yet even the most determined leader faced limits when confronting the resources of an entire republic. Crassus continued, tightening his control over the situation. His soldiers were better organized, better supplied, and increasingly successful at restricting the movement of the rebels. Opportunities that had once existed were disappearing. Spartacus understood that time was no longer on his side. Every passing month increased the risk to his followers and reduced his options for escape. Historical accounts suggest that Spartacus still hoped to lead many of his people to freedom, but circumstances became more difficult with each decision. Internal disagreements weakened parts of the movement. Some groups separated from the main force, others pursued different strategies. Maintaining unity among such a large population became increasingly challenging. Rome, meanwhile, remained focused on a single objective: ending the rebellion permanently. As pressure mounted, Spartacus continued demonstrating the qualities that had made him an effective leader from the beginning. He remained at the front of major operations, shared the hardships experienced by his followers, and refused to abandon the people who depended on him. These actions strengthened loyalty among those who remained. Even when the situation grew desperate, many still believed in him. However, belief alone could not change the reality that Rome was gathering overwhelming strength. Eventually, the conflict moved toward its decisive confrontation. Crassus prepared his forces carefully, determined to prevent any possibility of another Roman failure. Spartacus understood that avoiding conflict indefinitely was no longer possible. The future of the rebellion would likely be decided by what happened next. The final campaign was intense and exhausting for both sides. Resources became scarce. Conditions became more difficult. Every decision carried enormous consequences. Then came the battle that would define the fate of the uprising. Historical sources differ on some details, but they agree on one important fact. Spartacus fought until the very end. Rather than abandoning his followers or attempting to save himself, he remained committed to the cause he had led for years. When the conflict finally ended, Rome emerged victorious. The rebellion that had once terrified the Republic was over, yet one mystery remained. Despite the significance of Spartacus and the attention surrounding the rebellion, no confirmed record ever identified his final resting place. His body was never conclusively found. For Rome, the military victory restored control. For history, however, the story was far from finished, because although the rebellion had ended, the legend of Spartacus was only beginning to grow. Although Rome had defeated the rebellion, it could not erase the memory of Spartacus. For Roman leaders, the uprising served as a warning about the dangers of underestimating people who had lost everything. For ordinary citizens, the story became one of the most remarkable events of their generation. A man who had started as a slave had challenged one of the most powerful states in the ancient world and forced its leaders to take him seriously. Few people in history had ever achieved something so extraordinary. In the years that followed, stories about Spartacus continued spreading throughout the Roman world. Some accounts focused on his military skill, others emphasized his courage and determination. Over time, the details became mixed with legend, making it difficult to separate fact from storytelling. Yet one truth remained clear. Spartacus had become far more than a historical figure. He had become a symbol to many people. He represented resistance against oppression and the desire for freedom. His name survived long after the Roman politicians, soldiers, and officials who fought against him had been forgotten. Centuries passed, and new generations discovered his story. Writers, historians, artists, and filmmakers repeatedly returned to the life of Spartacus because his journey contained themes that never lose relevance. People understood his struggle because it reflected universal human desires: freedom, dignity, hope, and the courage to stand against overwhelming odds. Even in modern times, more than 2,000 years after his rebellion, Spartacus remains one of the most recognized figures from the ancient world. His story appears in books, documentaries, films, and classrooms across the globe. What makes this remarkable is that he left behind no kingdom, no empire, and no great monument bearing his name. Unlike many famous rulers, Spartacus did not build lasting political power. Instead, his legacy survived because of the ideas he represented. Rome achieved victory on the battlefield, but it could not control how future generations remembered the conflict. History often remembers powerful empires, yet it also remembers individuals who dared to challenge them. Spartacus became one of those individuals. His life demonstrated that even someone born without wealth, status, or influence could alter the course of history through determination and leadership. The rebellion ultimately failed to achieve its immediate goals, but the story endured because people continued finding inspiration in his example. More than 20 centuries later, the name Spartacus still carries meaning. It reminds us that freedom has always been one of humanity's most powerful motivations, and that extraordinary courage can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. That is why the story of Spartacus continues to be told today, not because he defeated Rome, but because he proved that even a slave could become a legend. When people think about history, they often remember emperors, kings, and powerful generals who ruled vast territories and commanded enormous armies. Spartacus was none of those things. He was not born into wealth. He did not inherit power. He never sat on a throne or governed an empire. In fact, history first knew him as a slave, a man who had almost no control over his own future. Yet more than 2,000 years later, his name remains one of the most recognized from the ancient world. That alone says something remarkable about the impact of his life. Spartacus lived during a time when Rome seemed unstoppable. The Republic expanded across continents, defeated powerful enemies, and controlled millions of people. Most individuals had little ability to influence such a massive system. Yet Spartacus proved that determination, leadership, and courage could inspire thousands to follow a common cause. His rebellion did not defeat Rome, but it forced the Republic to confront a challenge it never expected from those it considered powerless. The story also reminds us that history is not shaped only by victories. Sometimes, people are remembered because of what they stood for, rather than what they achieved. Spartacus became a symbol of freedom because he refused to accept the life others had chosen for him. He chose resistance over surrender and hope over fear. Those choices transformed him from an ordinary man into a lasting legend. Across generations, people continued telling his story because they recognized something universal within it. Every society contains individuals who dream of a better future, who seek dignity, and who refuse to let circumstances define their lives. Spartacus represented those ideals. That is why books, films, documentaries, and historians continue returning to his story, century after century. His life reminds us that influence is not measured only by wealth, titles, or military victories. Sometimes influence comes from inspiring others to believe that change is possible. In the end, Rome preserved its power. But Spartacus earned something different. He earned a place in history that has survived for more than 20 centuries. His rebellion ended, but his story never truly disappeared. And perhaps that is the most powerful lesson of all. A person may lose a battle, yet still leave behind an idea that continues inspiring people long after the battle itself has been forgotten. Thank you for listening to the story of Spartacus, the gladiator who challenged Rome and became one of history's most enduring symbols of courage, freedom, and determination.